Good afternoon or evening, everyone, and welcome. We'll get started in just a moment as we allow our participants to join. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rachel Stoll. I'm the Vice President of the Stimson Center, as well as the Director of our Conventional Defense Program, which seeks to reduce risk and minimize harm associated with the global arms trade. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event, Arms Trade Treaty Reporting in the Shadow of Ukraine, and very appreciative to the generous support of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and Switzerland for this event, but also for the research that I will be presenting later today. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has really had a profound impact on global peace and security, including by spurring an unprecedented volume of arms transfers to Kyiv. The profound impact these transfers have had on the conflict and the considerable diversion and civilian harms risks they pose have reinvigorated calls for transparency in the global arms trade. At the same time, challenges around the release of information on arms exports to Ukraine, including concerns that public disclosures could pose operational security risks, have highlighted the oftentimes significant barriers that exist to promoting arms trade transparency. The Arms Trade Treaty has a unique role to play in this regard as the only international instrument to legally require states parties to report annually on their arms exports and imports. In today's event, we'll be examining the ATT's recent contributions to arms trade transparency, particularly through the submission of ATT annual reports, discussing how transparency and reporting in the ATT context has been impacted by the war in Ukraine, and considering steps that can be taken in the years ahead to enhance ATT reporting and further realize the treaty's transparency aims. To start, it is my honor to introduce Ambassador Robert Indenbosch, Disarmament Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the Conference of Disarmament of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Geneva, who will deliver opening remarks for today's discussion. Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Rachel. First of all, let me just thank the Stimson Center for taking the good initiative to again organize this yearly ATT Monitor side event. Under the umbrella of the title of today's event, Arms Trade Treaty Reporting in the Shadow of Ukraine, we actually have a lot to discuss. And not only, I would say, about influx of weapons into Ukraine, there's much more happening, of course. In August, the new ATT Monitor report was presented and published. I had the honor to moderate an event on this occasion in the margins of the 9th meeting of states parties to the ATT. And the ATT Monitor report is, in our view, one of considerable richness in terms of not just the wide variety of topics covered, but more importantly, also the depth and quality in which these are covered. And today we have some of the experts here who contributed to this year's report, and I dare say exactly the right people to present us some background with regard to this year's edition. The ATT Monitor is an independent project of Control Arms and was first launched in January 2015. The Netherlands has been a long-term supporter of the project. Others include Austria, Australia, Ireland, Norway, and Trinidad and Tobago. And the ATT Monitor is a crucial document to keep track of reporting by ATT state parties and the level of transparency that they provide with regard to their arms exports. And as we all know, providing transparency on arms exports is an important confidence-building measure which contributes to peace and security. In my reading, the report does three things. It takes stock of the progress the Arms Trade Treaty is making to achieve its goal of preventing arms and ammunition diversion to fuel human suffering, looking at 3 case studies. And it examines progress on transparency compliance and gives country-by-country analysis. And last, It provides an overview of current implementation challenges and trends from previous years. Today, we also have the honor to attend the launch of a new report by the Stimson Center, which is titled 2022 Arms Trade Treaty Annual Reporting in the Shadow of Ukraine. And indeed, the war in Ukraine raises important questions and challenges regarding transparency and national reporting on arms exports. There are no easy answers to these questions, but that is precisely why it's important to discuss them among states and share best practices, and together uphold transparency as a core value in arms export control policy. And I have full confidence that the new report and our event today will be a valuable contribution to this effort. Transparency is and remains a key pillar for the ATT and for Dutch arms export control policy. However, we have to recognize the challenges with regard to arms transfers in the light of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. Due to my country's decision to supply arms to Ukraine in order to help exercise its rights to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, we had to limit transparency in some elements of our ATT and UNRWA reporting due to operational and other national security considerations. However, in ensuring to remain as transparent as possible, this year we have decided to share more details to the general public about the different categories of Dutch military support to Ukraine. Under this new policy, we have provided more details on types and quantity of military goods delivered, although in some cases we cannot share all information. For instance, on the transfer of more strategic type weapons, as this would provide unwanted insight into our national capacities and could potentially endanger our operational security and that of Ukraine. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor back to Rachel, who was involved in drafting the Niels Stimson Center report, and the other experts that are with us here today. And I look forward to a fruitful and constructive discussion online. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to the Netherlands for really recognizing and promoting the concept of transparency, even when it's hard, that the values sort of intrinsic to transparency are just paramount to ensuring a safe, legal, responsible, and accountable arms trade. I'm grateful today to be joined by Karina Somirano, who leads the ATT Monitor at Control Arms, to share insights from their work around ATT transparency and reporting. And in a moment, I'll walk you through some of the key takeaways and recommendations from the new report that the ambassador just mentioned that we are launching today. And then I will turn the floor over to Karina to share insights from the newest ATT Monitor report. Our presentations will be followed by a Q&A session, so I encourage you to share any questions you may have for the speakers through Zoom's Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them later in the event. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work, and you can see this. I'm going to assume it's good. Okay, so today marks the launch of Stimson's latest analysis of ATT annual reporting. And as was mentioned, and you can see on the screen here, the title of that report is 2022 Arms Trade Treaty Annual Reporting in the Shadow of Ukraine. This report identifies recent trends, challenges, and good practices in ATT annual reporting, as well as opportunities to strengthen reporting in the year ahead. This is based on Stimson's analysis of the past year of the ATT annual reporting process. Throughout the report, we discussed the various ways in which the war in Ukraine seems to have impacted ATT transparency and reporting over the last year. Now, my report today will only be able to highlight some of the key findings and recommendations in the report because I just don't have the time to cover everything. So I'm going to strongly encourage you to check out the report for yourself when you have the chance, and you can find the link in the chat. I'll also note that some of the data in this presentation is going to vary a little bit from the data in the report, since I'm excited to say that we've had one state, thank you, Denmark, submit its 2022 annual report after we'd already finalized the data for the analysis and sent the paper off for design. One of the principal aims of the ATT is to promote transparency in the international arms trade. And I think sometimes that is forgotten when we talk about the object and purpose of the Arms Trade Treaty. One of the ways it seeks to accomplish that is by establishing reporting requirements for states parties. States parties are required to submit two types of reports. The first is an initial report on measures undertaken to implement the treaty. The second, which is the one I will focus on today, is our annual reports on arms exports and imports that occurred during the previous calendar year. So the submission of these ATT annual reports is important not only to fulfill states parties' international legal obligations under the treaty, but also to provide insights that allow us to enhance awareness of regional and global arms flows, assist us in detecting potentially destabilizing weapons accumulation, or facilitate assessments of international law compliance. This year, 110 of the 113 states parties of the ATT were required to submit a report to the ATT Secretariat on arms exports and imports that occurred in 2022. The treaty requires these reports to be submitted by the 31st of May every year, although in practice, the Secretariat extends a 7-day grace period, creating a de facto deadline of 7 June 2023 for this year's reports to be considered on time. So as of today, 68 states parties, which is 62% of those that are due to report, have submitted their required 2022 reports. Only 38 or 35% actually submitted on time, but it's never too, I'm going to say this many times, it is never too late to submit an annual report. So it's great to see that that number has almost doubled in the past few months. So the current rate of compliance for 2022 reporting period, as well as the on-time compliance rate, are also, unfortunately, record lows. And they have continued an unfortunate pattern of year-to-year decreases in annual reporting compliance. And I think on-time reporting is actually one aspect of ATT reporting that is, in some cases, has been impacted by the war in Ukraine, because some states parties are now subject to additional internal reporting requirements surrounding their arms transfers to Ukraine, which can contribute to a delay in submitting ATT reports. This was the case for the United Kingdom, for example, which explained in an intervention at the Conference of States Parties that was just held in August that it submitted its 2022 report late because it was required to report first to the UK Parliament on the equipment and support it was provided to Ukraine in advance of its wider reporting obligations. Despite this year's low level of reporting compliance and the added challenges posed by the war in Ukraine, there really are some bright spots. When I gave this presentation last October, only 58% of the required 2021 annual reports have been submitted. So that figure has actually increased to 67% as reports have been submitted after last October. So with this year's compliance rate sitting just above the 2021 compliance rate at this time last year, and as states parties continue to submit their 2022 reports, I am hopeful that we will see a relative increase in reporting compliance this year. So it's not a bad news story yet, as long as we see other states submit their reports soon. It was also really encouraging to see developing and least developed states parties lead the way in on-time reporting this year. Of the first 4 2022 annual reports to appear on the ATT Secretariat's website, 2 were from least development countries, way to go Madagascar and Sierra Leone, and 1 was from a small island developing state, which is Mauritius. Since developing and least developed states parties are especially likely to face capacity and resource constraints, which are among the most commonly cited challenges to annual reporting, these states parties really should be commended for their early reporting, and stakeholders should consider engaging with them to learn from their experiences and identify any lessons learned. Another positive development were the 3 state parties that were due to report in previous years that submitted their first annual reports this year. This includes Brazil, which submitted its 2022 annual report, Lesotho, which submitted an impressive 8 reports over the past year, covering 2015 through 2022 reporting periods, and Zambia, which submitted 3 reports covering 2018 through 2021. Relatedly, 33 states parties submitted a total of 58 overdue reports since last year's de facto deadline. Cote d'Ivoire submitted 6 past due reports. Nigeria and Trinidad and Tobago each submitted 5 past due reports. And of course, we want states parties to report on time. There are benefits to knowing what sort of the trends are of the past year. But again, it's never too late to fulfill your reporting obligations and facilitate timely analysis of reporting data. So I really, really commend those states and encourage those who also have outstanding previous reports to submit those as soon as possible. I'll turn now to private reporting, which refers to the practice by some states parties of submitting reports with the preference that they be made available only to the ATT Secretariat and other states parties. So private reporting has posed a persistent challenge to transparency in the ATT context. It was also until very recently a growing challenge, with the rate of private reporting having dramatically increased over the first 6 years of ATT reporting. So against that backdrop, it's really extremely encouraging that we've seen private reporting rates decline for 2 consecutive years, from a high of 32% with respect to 2020 reports to 26% for this year's 2022 reports. This shift has probably been driven in part by states parties with histories of private reporting elect to report publicly, including 4 which did so this year. Now, with states parties restricting public access to over a quarter of the 2022 reports submitted to date, there's clearly more work to be done to encourage more transparent reporting practice, but I think this marks in part important progress, that I'm not saying we're seeing record highs this year. It's also important to bear in mind that some states had unique incentives to report privately this year, given political sensitivities around their arms transfers to Ukraine. With many of Ukraine's arms suppliers concerned about the potential security risks associated with disclosing information on their arms transfers to Ukraine, it may well be the case that these concerns contributed to some of last year's reporters providing information privately this year. As we discuss in this report, this seems especially likely in the case of 4 states parties that reportedly exported arms to Ukraine in 2022 and chose to report privately for the first or second time this year, following several years of public reporting. An issue that's closely related to the submission of private reports is the decision by some states parties to withhold commercially sensitive or national security information from the reports, which the ATT explicitly allows them to do. They're not doing anything nefarious or wrong. Of the states parties that submitted 2022 annual reports by the 5th of October, which was the cutoff for data for our report, 19 of them, or 39%, indicated that they withheld some commercially sensitive or national security information from their reports. This is a significant increase compared to the 27% that did so at this time last year with respect to 2021 reports. So at first blush, this may seem like a worrying shift from a transparency perspective, but counterintuitively, it may actually reflect a move towards more transparent reporting, because the increase in information being withheld from reports coincides with a recent decrease in private reporting. And this may might suggest that states parties are taking a more circumscribed and more transparent approach to address concerns around the release of potentially sensitive information by simply withholding that information from the reports and making the entirety of the rest of the report public instead of having the entire report be private. However, in truth, the reasons behind this shift are a little bit unclear, so I think this is another issue where additional examination might be necessary given the transparency implications. I think, as I said, this is another aspect of ATT reporting that is impacted by the war in Ukraine, because several states parties were actually very transparent in the reasons they withheld information. They said this information was not just withheld, but explained. So the Netherlands, for example, withheld most, but not all, of the information concerning the quantity of its arms exports to Ukraine on national security grounds. By contrast, at least 5 states parties appear to have withheld any mention of their arms exports to Ukraine. And the only reason that we know that is because those 5 countries, according to estimates from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, did transfer weapons to Ukraine, but none of those were included in their annual reports. Just a quick word on the types of information provided in these reports. Our report includes a detailed analysis of the types of information states provide. It focuses not only on whether states parties reported arms exports or imports, but also whether they provided information, while not explicitly required by the ATT, provides critically important insights into the nature of these transfers, including an indication as to whether the information reflects authorized or actual transfers, the number and or value of items transfers, information on the importing state, exporting state, state of origin, and description of the items or comments in the transfer. As I said, I don't have time to go into the detail of these kinds of pieces of information here, but I will say that there are some encouraging developments on this front. It wasn't uncommon in years past for states parties to report on their exports without identifying the importing state, but every state party that reported publicly on their exports in this year's report identified the importing states for these transfers. And also worthy of noting, the United Kingdom had never previously included information on imports in its annual report. It reported on major arms imports for the first time this year. So obviously there's still room for improvement around information states parties include in their report. As in previous years, some states parties aggregated key information in their reports or failed to indicate whether the data provided reflect actual or authorized transfers, both of which present meaningful and accurate assessments of reporting data. There is a lot of conversation about reporting synergies and reporting fatigue and ways to avoid such hardship. And so increased attention has been given to the link between ATT annual reports and the voluntary annual reports that states can submit to the UN Register of Conventional Arms, or UN ROCA, on their conventional arms exports and imports. And so this year, we compare and contrast ATT and UN ROCA report levels for the 2022 calendar year, as well as the types of information that were provided in those two reports. Now, ATT reporting levels have continued to outpace UN ROCA reporting during this most recent reporting period, but UN ROCA reporting rates are also increasing in recent years. I think this is probably due in part to ATT states parties now being able to tick a box in the revised ATT reporting template to authorize the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs to use these reports as the basis for their UN ROCA submissions. In a strange twist, we have two states parties that have yet to submit any of their required ATT annual reports, but that submitted reports to UN ROCA this year. So hopefully this suggests that they will be able and willing to report on arms transfers under the ATT as well. We also found that at least 5 states parties, these are because we can only see the public reports, of course, that reported on their 2022 arms transfers under both ATT and UN ROCA, reported on a wider range of transfers in the ATT as opposed to the UN ROCA reports. So in many cases, these states parties included information on their small arms light weapons transfers in their ATT reports that they did not submit in UN ROCA. So just to conclude, I often give this presentation and it's kind of a bad news story, but I think I'm more hopeful this year as we've seen some significant progress to strengthen transparency and reporting under the ATT, even as the war in Ukraine has in many ways complicated national efforts to report publicly on international arms transfers. Among other things, states parties really demonstrated their commitment to the treaty's transparency aims by submitting their first ever annual reports. There were closed significant reporting gaps through the submission of dozens of overdue reports and continuing their welcome shift away from private reporting. There's still a lot of work to be done with compliance still at frustratingly low levels, many states parties reporting in ways that undermine meaningful analysis of the reporting data. I think that we should not lose sight of the fact that this is a treaty obligation. States parties, the working group on transparency reporting, other stakeholders, including civil society, have an important role to play in addressing these issues, and it's particularly important that we prioritize outreach to non-reporting states parties to assist them in identifying and overcoming their reporting challenges, as well as continue to support initiatives, including the ATT Secretariat's peer-to-peer reporting assistance project to support the exchange of good practices and lessons learned for reporting. So realizing that the ATT's full potential will require continued and concerted effort, I'm still rather positive that significant strides were made this year, and really hopeful that we'll be able to sustain and build on this momentum during the CSP 10 cycle, so that when we're back here next year, I'll have an even better story to tell. With that, I will conclude my presentation and turn it over to my friend Karina to share some insights from the 2023 ATT Monitor.
Thank you, Rachel. And let me just see if I can share this. Can you see that? Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel, again, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here today in what it has become some sort of a tradition between the Stimson Center and the ATT Monitor to do this event in the margins of First Committee. Thank you, Ambassador Indenbosch, for your remarks and for your long-standing support for the ATT Monitor on behalf of the project and Control Arms. You know, we are very grateful. I want to also extend my gratitude to the Government of Canada, who has been instrumental in supporting this year's report as well. As the Ambassador mentioned, the ATT Monitor is an independent project of the organization Control Arms. It is, or it has become, the de facto international mechanism of the Arms Trade Treaty, and it currently serves as a source of information on the implementation of and compliance with the treaty. Our research and analysis seeks to strengthen the ATT implementation efforts by states parties, and also seeks to improve the transparency overall in the conventional arms trade. The report that I'm presenting today, as mentioned before, was launched in the margins of CSP9 in Geneva last August. So for those of you who were attending in person the launch of the ATT Monitor report, my presentation will seem very repetitive, but bear with me. We might address some of the questions that you couldn't ask back in August today. Just very quickly, because I'm only going to focus on one aspect of the report, but the report, the 2023 report, is divided into 4 main sections. In the first one, we pretty much do an assessment of what happened during last year between June 2022 to May 2023, and we include an analysis of universalization issues, systems, and procedures within the Conference of States Parties. And this year, we have also included a dedicated section to examine the impact of the war in Ukraine. Chapter 1 of our special section this year was focused on conventional ammunition and the Arms Trade Treaty. I think this chapter comes very timely because today the General Assembly just passed the resolution on the conventional ammunition program. Then chapter number 2 is our detailed analysis of 2021 annual reports. And then chapter 3 is an assessment of ATT initial reports and also updates to the 2022 annual reports that Rachel just presented, but that are only analyzed up until the deadline, the legal deadline of 31st May 2023. So because the topic of today is the discussion around transparency, we dedicate a lot in our annual report to discuss issues of transparency, and we do this in two ways. In the first part of chapter 2, which is chapter 2.1, we look at the quality of the information that annual reports contain. We have developed in the last couple of years a methodology or a methodological approach to do this, and we analyze annual reports under 3 lenses or 3 categories, which are described there. The first one, we look into whether annual reports are compliant with Article 13.3 reporting obligations. We then look into whether annual reports contribute to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. And finally, we also look at whether they contribute to a higher standard of transparency by including additional information.
Karina, sorry to interrupt you. Can you minimize the speakers on your screen? Because on your slide, I can't read your whole presentation. We can only, or just move it over to the side.
Let's see. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you mean, Rachel.
So on your screen,
yeah,
we can see the speakers in your gallery view. If you can minimize that. So
okay.
If you see what I mean? Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Now we can see your whole slide. Thank you.
Let me see. Okay. Yeah. Am I on the right slide now? So moving on with the first category of analysis that I just mentioned, we consider an annual report to be compliant with the requirements of Article 13.3 if they are submitted to the ATT Secretariat in the first place, if they are submitted on time, meaning within 1 week of the 31st May deadline, and if they include both exports and imports of conventional arms or relevant NIL reports indicating that no transfers were made. So for 2021, what we saw in the analysis presented is that there was a continuation of a long-term trend of decreasing compliance. 110 states parties were required to submit by 31st May 2022 an annual report on their imports and exports, and only 60 states parties did so by that deadline. This percentage is up until that point was the lowest since reporting began in 2015. We now know that it might be lower for this year. On-time reporting in 2021 was also relatively low at 40% of compliance. About 24 states parties submitted their reports between the 7th June deadline and our deadline of analysis, which is 1st of February. So when we put together these three indicators that I just mentioned, we find that only 42 states parties fully comply with this first sort of category with the reporting obligations of Article 13.3. And this is a little bit lower than the number and percentage of the states party who did this for 2020, and you can see that in the screen, the sort of the trends on the slide. We then go and analyze how annual reports fulfill the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty as stated in Article 1 of the ATT. For us, or for the monitor, we consider that to be meaningfully transparent and to contribute to these aims and objectives, an annual report should at least, should at least be submitted and made publicly available on the ATT Secretariat website. It should also provide information disaggregated by weapon type, by importer and exporter, indicate whether those transfers were only authorizations or actual transfers, and provide the number of units or the financial value or both for each weapon type. Again, looking at this whole panorama, we see that only 28 states parties submitted 2021 annual reports that fulfill this criteria of being meaningfully transparent. The good news, as Rachel just mentioned, was that in 2021, the rate of confidential or private reporting also dropped compared to the 2020 cycle. So hopefully this is going to become a new trend moving forward. The proportion of annual reports that disaggregate information also fluctuates quite considerably. We have good examples and not others. Some states are more prone to present the information disaggregated by weapon type, and some others present more information on the units or the financial value. It's kind of a very divergent panorama. So whatever improvement we might see in some of these indicators or areas might sometimes be counterbalanced by the deterioration of transparency in other areas. And this, in general, is what it's leading to an overall decline in transparency more broadly. The third and final category of analysis that we do in the annual report is that we look at those reports that go beyond at this minimum information, and that we would like to commend when they do. These annual reports are ultimately contributing to a higher standard of transparency as a result. And under this category, we have many ideal points, many ideal indicators, 8 of them. I'm just going to mention only 3. We look, for instance, at whether annual reports include descriptions and comments on the transfers. We look at whether they indicate if commercially sensitive or national security information was or not withheld and where. And we also look at whether they include national definitions of conventional arms or voluntary national categories. And here what we found is that 34 states parties submitted annual reports providing descriptions, 28 of them provided comments. And this was an improvement compared to 2021 annual reports. So that's a positive trend. 11 states parties included data on arms transfers that are covered within the scope of Article 2, but that are not explicitly specified in the reporting template. And so, for example, we have some countries that have reported the export or import of shotguns. Under this category, we also look closely at how and if ammunition is reported under the ATT. As you know, reporting ammunition is not a requirement under the treaty. However, the ATT reporting template offers an opportunity to states parties to report on a broader range of arms by including this section on voluntary national categories and categories for other small arms or light weapons. So in 2021, we found 4 states parties, Estonia, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, who submitted reports that included this additional information on ammunition imports or exports. And so to finalize this section, our analysis shows that no state party in 2021 fulfilled all the different criteria, and not all of them utilize the mechanisms outlined here for higher transparency. 19 states parties were the ones who sort of comply with each of these different categories of analysis that I just mentioned, but only 3 of them provided the most information that supports a higher standard of transparency. These 3 states, Peru, South Africa, and Sweden, coming from completely different regions with different development and political and social realities, should be commended for their effort to improve the quality of reporting. And these are also countries with excellent, that show a really good example of how reporting can be improve over time and further the transparency goals in the Global Arms Trade Treaty. Very quickly, this is our section 2.2, the country profiles that we also present each year in the annual report. The aim here is to provide with a detailed analysis of how a state party has evolved and evolves year after year in the reporting practice. So we analyze, as you can see there, we provide areas of good practice, we provide areas for improvement, and we also give a summary of the export data and the import data of each state party. So I encourage you to look for each of your states parties, take a look at that information, compare with what has been published before, and let us know if there is any inconsistency, or if you would like to discuss more in detail what is it that these country profiles are aimed at. Within the country profiles, one of the things I just added this morning because I was asked at CSP9, what is it that states are reporting the most in terms of transfers of weapons? And we see here that both in the imports and in the export sort of categories, The small arms is, of course, it takes the largest percentage of what states are reporting. We then have national categories in export data, and major conventional weapons is actually a shorter percentage of what is reported by state bodies. And when you look at this data, one word of caution: first of all, this is the percentage of what is only publicized or informed by states parties. We do not compare this information with what other institutions are publishing, nor CIPRI. We don't compare to UNROCA. This exercise would entail a completely different sort of analysis, and it would show a completely different picture of the global arms transfers. So to finalize, I just want to encourage you again, for those who have not done yet, to take a look at the full report. If the full report is too long, we have also summaries in 3 languages. They are posted on our website. And I also encourage you to stay tuned for the upcoming launch of the ATT portal. We aim to launch this before the end of the year, and the portal will serve as the central hub for comprehensive information related to the ATT, offering a user-friendly interface for all ATT stakeholders. We hope that when you see this on our social media, that you can also provide us with information in case that we have missed any of the resources that we aim to present. So with that, I finish. Thank you very, very much. And I look forward to your questions. Rachel?
Thank you, Karina. I think for those who have not looked at or unpacked the ATT Monitor, it remains an invaluable resource for comprehensive information on ATT reporting. And the country profiles in particular are really useful to understand sort of the trends that we're seeing over time, but within individual countries as to, as you said, what kinds of weapons are being reported on and transferred. And it's really, really a useful resource. And I look forward to using the portal in the very near future. So I do want to remind our audience that they can post questions in the Q&A. We've spent a lot of time talking at all of you, and although we remain in this virtual format, we do want this to be a discussion. So do welcome your comments or questions or comments as we're waiting for those to come in. And I would remind our viewers, there are viewers on the live stream as well. As those come in, I think, Karina, the question I would have for you is, as you are putting the ATT Monitor together every year, which is a massive undertaking, what is the largest challenge that you face in terms of transparency? And maybe there's not just one. As someone who also puts this data together, there really isn't just one. But what are some of the challenges that you?
Where do I start? Well, I think that sometimes it at least since I've been with the project, for the past, I think 4 cycles, I think it's probably trying to be fair to the states that make an effort, that produce information, that submit the reports, but also trying to understand to the ones that do have the capacity why they don't fully exploit that capacity to report better. I think, there is that dichotomy of seeing sometimes states that are less developed that are really, really good reporters in terms of our own methodological considerations, right, on what transparency or not transparency, levels they have. And then, other most developed, nations that could, take more advantage of a lot of the tools and resources that I and other institutions have developed over time. The amount of information I know that is overwhelming, and especially for countries that have larger
chunks of information to provide, right? The large exporters, of course, they need to collect the data with more anticipation. There are national security considerations, but I think that at the end of the day, they should serve as the example that there are ways to be transparent, and there are ways to improve the information. We have seen over time how some countries, some states parties have changed their practice and have improved transparency, and this is very welcoming. But we have also seen the effort of less developed countries doing the same. So I think in that sense, to me, that's very welcoming. But at the same time, the previous issue of this dichotomy of, some states having the capacity and not fully reporting everything that we wish they would.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the, and we had tried, just in full disclosure, to have some states who have successfully overcome some of their reporting challenges participate today, but had to rearrange at the last moment. But I do think that more investigation into, and Stimson has done extensive research, and we can put in the chat some of our research on what the reporting challenges are for states, and then some good practice for overcoming them. But there has to be sort of a dedicated effort, not just from civil society, from other states, from the ATT Secretariat, from other stakeholders, to really work one-on-one with states. Stimson has a really exciting program at the moment where we are looking at the 29 countries that have struggled to fulfill their reporting obligations, and work one-on-one with them and identify what are those challenges, how can we help you overcome them, what resources might be useful in terms of trainings, or simply helping identify an interagency process for developing your reporting data. The theme of next year's Arms Trade Treaty Conference is on interagency cooperation. So it's a great opportunity for states to revisit how they are putting their internal processes together. What stakeholders within their own bureaucracies are they including in the transparency and reporting process? Do they have a single calendar that identifies all of the deadlines and who is responsible for collecting that data? So I think it's really important. We have a question about Asian countries, and if Asian countries are contributing to the ATT process. And certainly, and Karina, feel free to jump in, we do see that those ATT states parties that are from the Asia Pacific region are completing their reports at a higher percentage rate, but there are far fewer of them that are states parties. So in terms of universalization, I would say that the Asia Pacific region still has quite a bit of work to do, but we do have Asian states participating in the ATT and in ATT reporting. And that includes, for this year, there were 10 states from the region that were required to report, which is only 9% of all of those that were required. And 2 of them have yet to report. So that's only 8% of those that are outstanding. So that's a pretty good number so far.
Yeah, and one important issue with the low rates of universalization in Asia, but I think on the positive note, this year, the Philippines, for instance, right, they submitted their initial report right after the deadline, and I think this shows that with political commitment, things are possible, because in general, you would expect that maybe some states would take longer to present, and this is your experience, Rachel, of looking into how long do new states parties to the treaty take to present their initial report. So hopefully the example of Philippines can also be mirrored in the future with new incoming members from the Asia Pacific region.
Ambassador, I don't know if you want to say anything about universalization in the Asia Pacific region. I want to include you in this conversation as well.
Well, it is, of course, an important region, and we should not forget about it. This morning, one of the important states there, still not ATT, but at least sharing information with NWACA. So we have to look, of course, at the broader picture. But universalization is and remains an issue not only for the ATT but for many arms control treaties, and it was one of the issues that we discussed intensively in the last few days in the first committee, because we should not be complacent, of course, and try to work on it also. Otherwise, we get a distorted picture if we have only well, for instance, take the Ukraine case. If we have only let's say the figures of the arms going into Ukraine, but not the other side. Yeah, we should, of course, try to have a complete picture on all the important arms trade dealings, and also to prevent that certain undesirable traffic schemes go in the different direction that get out of sight. And for that reason, yeah, we very much support all the efforts there are with regard to making the ATT as universal as possible. And I think it was also said today, it's important to work on taking away fear with regard to reporting. I think that's important. For that reason, also the possibility to share the reports between ATT and UNRWA is already a very important one. I know that also in the framework of the OSCE information is shared. Countries that are members of the European Union and NATO share information, and the closer the questions are to each other, the easier it becomes for capitals. I myself worked in capitals sometime, and it's always a burden also because people change, and that might again that you have to start again by educating people to be able to fill out the forms, and to fill out the forms completely, and to fill out the forms in time. And that's all important, because if they come, yes, of course, it's still useful if they come in later, but of course for the analysis it doesn't help, because you want to do something as of February, and if you only have a handful, yeah, that gives also a distorted picture, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. There's a question about what mechanisms exist under the ATT to seek clarifications on the information in the submitted reports, and are there options available to civil society in this regard? I'm not sure the treaty itself I know the treaty itself does not reference this, but certainly there are informal ways in which clarification can be submitted. So obviously for those states who report only privately and can only be seen by the Secretariat or other states' parties, those individuals can reach out and ask for clarification. We as civil society, and I'll let Karina speak to her experience, but we as civil society are constantly looking at those reports and asking clarification questions. We've done that just on this most recent report to make sure that we are understanding clearly what states' intent was, or if there was simply a typo, or something was filled out in a way that was contradictory on purpose. And so we're constantly asking questions about particular reports and particular transfers, and making sure that we understand the data. And that often happens as well within the ATT process itself, at working groups and preparatory committee meetings, where there are substantial discussions on transparency as well. Karina, I don't know if you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that the civil society has played a role in also sort of verifying to a certain extent that the information that they submit is the information they wanted to submit. Two examples last year between Rachel's teams and our team, we pretty much contacted two states who had reported privately, and it caught our attention that this was the first time that they were doing that, and eventually we realized that there were mistakes possibly when they submitted the report, and that they had indicated in the wrong button or in the wrong box that the annual report should be private, when they never meant that the annual report should be private. But another example is also sometimes looking into, especially with some of the states that in my region in Latin America that I have a reach out, and also with language-wise, sometimes it helps. I discuss a lot with them if that's the information that they were presenting, because maybe there was discrepancies with UNRWA. And so that has led to an exercise in which we compare information. We make sure they have asked for us should I put it in this line? Should I put it in this line? How do I report this other one? So I think there's also an opening from states parties to learn how to best report if you approach them. I think that's something that we should definitely take forward.
Thanks, Karina. I mentioned in my comments that the theme of the 10th Conference of States Parties to the ATT in this coming up August, so 10 months from now or so, that interagency cooperation is the theme. And so one of the questions is about how will transparency fit into that theme, and will it provide new insights or avenues towards achieving greater transparency under the treaty? I think the short answer is we don't know yet, and we're looking for some signals as to what that might look like. But I think it certainly could serve as an opportunity to enhance and remind states about their obligations with regards to reporting and the overall aim of transparency. Because interagency cooperation, for anyone, and we have a lot of states participating on this webinar today, as any state stakeholder will tell you, there are a lot of people that go into filling out that actual report. It is not simply one person compiling all the information themselves and then signing. So you may have one person who signs the report or a national point of contact responsible for the report, but there are a lot of individuals from a lot of different agencies that feed into the collection of that data, whether it's for the initial report, which is on measures undertaken to implement the treaty, which requires, a whole of government approach to arms transfers, ranging from enforcement and customs all the way through to licensing and risk mitigation. And so you have a very wide group of individuals that are involved. So hopefully this will provide an opportunity to talk about good practices with regards to compiling information, so reporting and record keeping, but also in terms of strengthening those processes to ensure timely, complete, comprehensive reports. Karina or Ambassador, and maybe you have more insights into the plans of the Romanian presidency.
I'm afraid I haven't at this moment. For us, it's still the last conference is rather fresh in memory. But indeed, in the run up to the next one, this will be something that is an issue that deserves our attention. I remember it also from The Hague. You have different players, of course. The one who works at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is collecting certain information, is always depending on the one side, the Ministry of Defense, on what's coming in, and on the other side of the Ministry of Economic Affairs, what's going out. There we have, of course, a license system, but there you have, of course, different categories again compared to what the questionnaire is looking for, and you have to make that match. And of course, if you, the ideal would be if you could match your own legislation and export control systems on that, but that's unfortunately in many cases not possible. And then we have, of course, international arrangements where we work together on export regimes, and that all has to fit, and that is a challenge. And the more there are, of course, the more difficult it becomes. And as I said before, one of the issues is often also just a very basic thing, but people tend to move every 3-4 years. And sometimes you start from zero again, and that is it's not always something that is in a good handover. We try to make it a fixed issue always in a handover memo between between the outgoing and the incoming. That helps, of course, but it's still sometimes a single point of failure, and that is something we have to think about in making it more secure, that there is still knowledge available also if you have a change of personnel. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador. There's another question about regional efforts to improve ATT reporting transparency, or region-to-region assistance to the same end. And I think one of the ways in which that has been looked at is through the Voluntary Trust Fund, that individual countries, but also a group of countries can put in a proposal to have assistance to support reporting or any number of other areas for ATT compliance and implementation. And so that is an opportunity. I know in my own personal experience prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, I had been traveling around the world, undertaking reporting workshops that were often individual countries, but sometimes also regions or sub-regions. So looking at the CARICOM region, for example, the Caribbean, as well as communities of Pacific Island states as well at a sub-regional basis. So I think there have been in the past efforts. I think that the pandemic slowed a lot of the in-person training that really is, there's no substitute for having people in a room and saying, we're going to talk about ATT implementation, and today's topic is reporting, and getting people in the room to actually complete the reports while they're sitting there with their interagency counterparts. There's no substitute for that, but it is something I hope that the peer-to-peer exercises that are undertaken by the ATT Secretariat can also examine, so not just individual countries, but lessons learned from region to region. And certainly, as I said, the Voluntary Trust Fund is an avenue for states to pursue. I don't know if either of you have had experience in that regard.
Well, we actually are right now looking into doing some sort of a similar outreach effort here in Latin America, following the ATT Secretariat's idea of peer-to-peer assistance and the regional champions sort of debate that happened this year. Because we have identified in Latin America that you do have these, really good examples, and some others who still have room for improvement, and states that have never reported either. So hopefully, that will be a new region where we can at least pilot and see where this leads, and whether, more assistance is needed. And I take this as an opportunity for the future. And to our participants, if you are from that region, please reach out to us and let's exchange some ideas on how to do this.
Karina, there's a question for you about the ATT portal and what it will contain, and if it will provide information for states parties as well as for those who are interested in the ATT.
Yeah, and this is a really good one, because and that's why I said, it would be useful if you can also tell us, what is it that you would like to see. So far, the way that we are doing the ATT portal is to centralize a lot of information on research, on resources. So resources would be, where a state party or an NGO or an institution can go and apply for assistance. There will be also a dedicated web page on reporting. So thank you for that comment. We might include links to the ATT Secretariat in the template, so everything is centralized there and easy to download. We are also including the different databases that exist on arms transfers. So the CIPRI one would be there. Prior ones, for instance, the NISAT, which PRIO used to have in the past, showing the trade in small arms and light weapons. Of course, as resources, it would be, Control Arms Resources and the Stimson Center, CIPRI, UNIDIR. The idea is that, everything can be centralized, and in one website, people would be able to access to quite a wealth of resources for their work or for their own research purposes. So any other any other idea that you might have, or any need in particular that a state might have identified as something that, I never find this information, please let us know, and we would be very happy to include that.
Thank you. There's another question for the ATT monitor about the contents of the monitor, and whether it looks at ways to strengthen other regulatory transfer processes. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about what the rest of the monitor, for example, the table of contents each year, what that looks like.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say we haven't done much on brokering. This particular question was on brokering, but every year we have, since 2015, we have dedicated the first chapter of the monitor report to discuss issues of implementation, to discuss issues of universalization, but also up until most recently, we would dedicate quite a number of pages to discuss the CSP presidency theme. So, for instance, in the past, it has been on GBV, gender-based violence. We had a dedicated chapter on that, on diversion and transparency in the 2020, stockpile management, where we do have a little bit on brokering and transiting in that chapter, as far as I remember, but we haven't dedicated it specifically to that. So every year we look, we analyze and we discuss with our advisory team the content of the annual report, and sometimes we prioritize the presidency theme, and some other times we prioritize other themes that have never been touched by the ATT monitor. For instance, this year, the one on conventional ammunition.
Thanks, Karina. There's a question about the balancing of public transparency, particularly with regards to Ukraine, and the need to protect state interests. And so the question is about, why is it important to have public reporting at all? And I sort of went into this a little bit in my opening remarks. But I think, when we think about transparency, it's not just because we want nice reports for Karina and I to sort of look through and investigate. But there's really a purpose to transparency. Transparency does serve as a confidence building measure. We've seen the dangers of a lack of transparency, and the actual creation of the UN Register of Conventional Arms came out of the global lack of knowledge about arms transfers that had been sent to Iraq, and the surprise in which countries felt when it was clear that Saddam Hussein had been able to amass such an arsenal of weapons without the world sort of knowing. Individual countries maybe knew, but you didn't have a global picture. So this need to be transparent not only is confidence building, but also serves as a way to identify potentially destabilizing weapons accumulation, or to identify potential trends and to serve as an early warning mechanism for potential conflict. But it also, in terms of the ATT context, it's important to, if you're looking at what the object and purpose of the ATT is, which the first one down below is transparency and confidence in the global arms trade, but is to reduce human suffering. And we know that these are lethal items. We know that they have a place in legitimate trade, but we also know that there is compliance issues for compliance with the international obligations in the Arms Trade Treaty that need to be adhered to, and there needs to be accountability for. And so it gives us some insights in allowing us to recognize when we've seen violations of that compliance, when we are seeing states behave in ways that are not permitted under the ATT. So there's, I think, a lot of benefits to public reporting. And as in terms of why public versus just among states parties, I think it is clear over time the role of civil society in drawing attention to examples of violations of international law, of state behavior that is not compliant with national, regional, or international obligations. And states, in many cases, the arms trade is subsidized by the citizens and the taxpayers of that particular country. And so there's a right of oversight and accountability there in terms of responsible state action. So as part of the democratic process, I also think it's really important that we are transparent in arms transfers. And I will say, outside of the ATT context, my program at the Stimson Center has been very vocal about the benefits of transparency with regards to U.S. arms transfers to Ukraine. And in fact, we're seeing in some cases a greater level of transparency about arms transfers to Ukraine than we see in other contexts. So I think it's really important, as part of the democratic process, as part of dialogue that occurs between citizens, their representative governments, and those national security and foreign policy decisions, that we're able to have a dialogue that everyone is sort of on the same page and understanding the same facts. But Karina and Ambassador Indenbosch, I'll turn that over to you, because you probably also have strong feelings about, given that we're all here, about public transparency.
We have, of course,
Yeah.
we have a clear position on that as Netherlands. We very much appreciate the role of civil society, and we think that's helped, and it is also mutually reinforcing in a way. And what you were saying with regard to democratic societies, and indeed the population knowing what in many cases is happening with taxpayers' money is important. It could also be, you already said it, it is of course originally meant as a confidence building measure, and it can sometimes also even help to debug all kinds of stories that go around. We see it especially around the conflict in Ukraine. Sometimes things are said that are not entirely the truth, or entirely not the truth, and also clear. Well, as much as transparency there can be, it can help to have this picture in a report that gives an overview on what is being done. And why it's being done. And we also have to think, of course, about post-conflict situation, how much has gone into that country, because that is sometimes also an issue. To indeed later on, when there are discussions on what was delivered or what was not delivered, that can help better understand, and also in the future prevent that you get again flows of arms into directions you don't want to have them. I remember there was a lot done in the past where there were surpluses of small arms like weapons and ammunition and manpads. We were all very concerned, especially about manpads. Now, of course, a lot has been delivered. So there's also a lot to look after in the future still, if not everything is used. So that and reporting can help then also in that case, I would say.
I don't think I have much to add, but I think that perhaps sometimes our insistence is because we as civil society are the ones who can ask the difficult questions. And so I think even for states is a value that civil society has access to public information, because it's a way sometimes for states to, forget about those difficult questions and just rely on an unbiased analysis by the different institutions, the public institutions, civil society, research, university, etc., that can pose and challenge and ask these difficult questions.
So we have a lot of questions left in the chat, but I know we're running short on time. So perhaps I'll use this last question as a way to sum up our conversation today, but also to maybe lead us to where we'll be next year. So this year's report that Stimson launched was In the Shadow of Ukraine. And there's a question about, will the conflict in Israel and Gaza next year affect 2023 arms reporting exercises? And I think it does bring additional questions about transparency and willingness to share information, and perhaps an environment that is even more sensitive than what we've seen in Ukraine. So maybe I'll, as part of your closing remarks, maybe again reinforcing the value of transparency despite what is happening in the world, and if we think that the Israel-Gaza conflict will affect transparency next year. Karina, I'll start with you.
It's a very delicate issue. It was as well when the war in Ukraine started. We were questioning and we were doubting how much information states would disclose and inform about their arms transfers. We realized that with lots of difficulties, many states, including the Netherlands, making this difficult decision of, withholding some information, but they still fulfill that obligation. I would hope, first of all, that the conflict between Gaza or Palestine and Israel comes to an end soon. But besides that, I also would hope that conflicts in general do not become an excuse for lowering transparency. I think to some, it might seem reasonable. Oh, well, this is the situation now, so we're not going to share this information. I think not sharing information, not being transparent, and especially in the context of the ATT, when reporting is an obligation, it's not mandatory. This is not UN-ROCA. This is a mandatory requirement. I think using the excuse of conflicts can be very detrimental, especially in light of the 10th anniversary of the treaty. We are reaching that point where it is time to take stock of all the difficulties that states parties faced in this 10 years and all the difficulties that they may face in the future to continue implementing the treaty and being transparent in this regard.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, yeah, let's hope indeed that the conflict between Hamas and Israel will not be something that we will see for a very long time. But we have to be realistic. We see what's happening. Israel, on the one hand, is exercising a right of self-defense. On the other hand, of course, there is the human suffering. It has been underlined by my government, has been underlined by the EU also. There is always the applicability of international humanitarian law. If it comes to export licenses, that is something we very much take into account. Also, of course, arms exports are something we do within the European Union. We have there certain rules about it, and of course we take the ATT with when we consider export licenses as one of the things that has to be ticked off, and it is always on a case-by-case basis. So we will have to see. Of course, we have been always clear. We very much think that transparency is important, and we think it's so important that even if we are not transparent, we want to be transparent about not being transparent, and that is not just playing with words. That is exactly what we are doing. We look very, very carefully at it and then try to explain why we are not transparent, but we might be transparent then in due time. This is one of the issues, of course. We have seen that a little bit later. We can sometimes be more transparent because in the case of Ukraine, we see that, of course, certain deliveries have to be protected when they take place. But once they have taken place, it becomes something different. For other issues, we have been very transparent before they even took place. If you look at, for instance, with what we have done with the F-16 project to support Ukraine, everybody could see it at the television when the Ukrainian president was visiting the Netherlands. So there you see also different approaches in different cases, and depends also on the kind of systems you are delivering. I think for the time being, that's it, because, and of course, there's also a delay, of course, with reporting. So next year, there won't be much, I think, because you're always lagging 1 year behind. So that is, we have to be realistic on that also.
No, I think those are really important points that you both made. And I would hope that the exceptional measures that we've seen to sort of limit insights into Ukraine-related transfers this year in particular aren't normalized in years to come, because as much as we would hope that peace will prevail around the world, we know that conflicts are have occurred around the world, and as Karina said, we don't want to use them as an excuse. And in fact, there's even more of a demand for transparency in times of conflict to ensure that that we are being responsible and accountable in those arms transfers. I think overall, what we've all noted is there has to be dedicated attention to these issues. Transparency doesn't just appear, it has to be very well considered and thought out, and there have to be dedicated resources and capacity put towards reporting every year. It has to be a priority of states. And I know in many cases when I have done workshops in different countries, people will say to me, how do I convince the political appointees that this is an exercise worth undertaking? We have numerous priorities in our government. We have limited capacity and limited resources. How do we make this a priority? And I think that's until we answer that question appropriately for each individual country, because it will vary on, there isn't just one answer to that. I think we will see reporting continue to be a challenge. In the ATT context, I continue to encourage states that have restricted access to the reports, or they've withheld information, or they're behind on submitting the reports, to reevaluate their policies and procedures. And hopefully the situation will change, and countries can be more transparent in the year to come, and that as we continue to do these events, maybe there won't be a need for these events as much anymore, because it will become such a normalized part of the ATT process. I know we have additional questions about, has China reported? What is their role? China has reported. It is a private report. You can go to the ATT Secretariat's website. You can see the same thing that Karina and I see every day when we go on that website and click on the individual reports to see if where your country is. Have they reported? Have they restricted access? What kind of information is available? You can get that primary source information from the website. I really want to thank Karina, as always, for being a great partner in transparency. It's nice not to walk this road alone, and to have another consistent voice at the table, and to Ambassador Indenbosch, not only for your constant support of transparency, but your personal interest in this issue and your thoughtful comments as well, and to the Kingdom of the Netherlands and to the government of Switzerland. Thank you for supporting this event here today, as well as the newest Stimson publication. To all of you watching, thank you for your attendance and participation today. We look forward to continued conversations, not only on transparency and arms transfers, but on the ATT specifically as well. Thank you so much, and have